Organization for Black Struggle in St. Louis. I'm going to be the moderator. I am Jamala Rogers, one of the founding members of the Organization for Black Struggle. We have 3 dynamite panelists this evening that are going to share their insights and experiences, and I'm looking forward, I've been looking forward to this webinar for a while. So it actually has been in the making for a minute or two as well. I think I've had conversations with most people about where we are in the Black left, where we are in our movements, where our Black radical organizations are. And this is an effort to broaden that conversation nationally. The thing that really prompted me, I was at a conference and one of the elders asked us, challenged us and said, why are your all's organizations in such turmoil? Because you have so many lessons to be learned from the history. And one of the organizations that she lifted up was the Universal Negro Improvement Association. So she said, this is a group that was international, had 30 chapters across the world, had more than members. This has not been repeated before or since. So she said, that's your challenge, to get 2 million people in your organization. So I'm like, okay, that's quite a challenge. But, you know, obviously the conditions were different in 1919, the early part of the 20th century. But I still think there's some lessons to be learned. So we have the first panelist is going to be Linda Burnam, and Linda is one of the founding members of the women's resource, the women's color resource. Wait a minute, I got my things mixed up. The Women's Resource Center for Women of Color. And she's been very active in other groups, including a lot of reproductive justice groups and women's issues overall. Next, we're going to have Bill Fletcher, and Bill is one of the founding members of the Black Radical Congress. He's an internationally known labor activist. Just recently got some kind of famous award for his podcast, and so congratulations on that, Bill. And then we have Taliba Obuya from the Malcolm X Grassroots Organization, who's been very active, particularly in Black radical national organizations and helping to grow the network of Malcolm X grassroots organizations. So we have they're going to be able to present first, and then we're going to open it up for questions from the participants who have joined us. So Linda, you want to go first? And this segue is one of the things that I've continually to be struck with is the very intensive summation of the demise of the Women's Resource Center. And so we sent that out as a prerequisite reading for people just to get it. And I still think it's one of the most extensive and comprehensive ones that I've seen since. So take it away, Linda.
Thank you so much for organizing us into this, Jamal. I really do appreciate it. You've brought me back to something I hadn't thought about in quite some time. It was a painful period, closing out an organization, but there are a lot of lessons there as well. So I'm just going to try and go through a few of them, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation. The first thing I want to say is that building organizations is hard. Is real hard, and major props to everybody who's played a role in trying to figure out how to build movements dedicated to liberation. It's real hard work. And in terms of the Women of Color Resource Center, I guess the first thing I'll say is that we were able to look back on this in some kind of halfway coherent way because of one value that I want to convey, which is the value of documenting your work, of reflecting on your work, of analyzing your work, and of drawing the lessons. And so this is also something that I've raised in new contexts. After I left the Women of Color Resource Center, I moved on to work for a decade or so in the National Domestic Workers Alliance. And it's something that I've tried to convey to the sisters in that organization, which is that if you feel like you're putting resources, you're gathering resources, you're doing something that's hard or new or bold, if all that is happening and you've gathered your members and supporters to do it, then that work is worth documenting and worth reflecting on. And I think in our movement, forward motion is a really good thing. Visioning is a really good thing. Executing the campaign, whatever that may be, is a really important thing. But being able to analyze what happened, what was the balance of forces, how did you move people behind your vision, what did it take? This both as a means of keeping folks in an organization on the same page, of sharing lessons with members, and as a means of passing on lessons to those who are not in your immediate circle and to future generations. So I just want to lift up here the importance of documentation and archiving. So think about the important work that you're doing now that people need to learn from and that needs to be preserved for future generations. And for the folks who are on this call who are on the older end of the age spectrum, as I am, I hope you all are also thinking about being interviewed and making sure that the contributions you all have made as individuals are being documented as well. So I just want to say that this document, it is in fact serving its purpose, one we could not have projected at the time that we did this. In a Color Resource Center, I guess as an organization, we were standing on the shoulders of movement leaders. The Women of Color Resource Center traces its direct line of descent to the to SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and to a Black Women's Caucus that formed in SNCC, and that at the time, which now we're talking about the late 1960s, was interested in trying to sort out how did the emerging consciousness around women's oppression and women's rights, what bearing did that have on Black women in particular in this Black Women's Caucus in SNCC. And so the Women of Color Resource Center grew out of that, and then an organization called the Third World Women's Alliance. And I say all that to say that it grew up in a period of a lot of forward momentum in the Black liberation movement, in anti-racist movements, in what were then called third world movements, none of which were encased in a 501c3 nonprofit structure. All of which were run mostly on the basis of volunteer labor, people who came forward and figured out how to do the work of the organization after work, or they took off from work, or before work. They had jobs and they did this as well. It was not like they got a paycheck out of the movement. So this is not a critique of nonprofit structures, although there are critiques to be made. It's just to say that the Women of Color Resource Center, which became a nonprofit, traced back to these other kinds of organizations, and then had to sort out in a different political period, how do you carry forward the values and lessons from a period when the people's movement, when the Black liberation movement, when people of color are in motion, moving, really at its height in the 60s and 70s, how do you take that energy into a different period in which things are a little bit more laid back in terms of social movements? So the Women of Color Resource Center ended up in a nonprofit structure, and those structures have their own weaknesses. So I'm assuming that some of you are familiar with nonprofit organizations, and so you know that generally speaking, there's an ED, a board, and a staff. And so there are many, many questions within those structures. One of them being, to whom is the executive director accountable, and how is the power of that position exercised and wielded, and the difficulties that executive directors face in a role in which the varied roles of fundraising, budget management, staff management, board management, programmatic vision, and effective programmatic execution, all of that is kind of bound up in one position. And people, frankly, some people come to those positions without not much in the way of particular training. I certainly did, just speaking for myself. So this can be a fair amount of learning on the job, and it's a very broad skill set. So I would also say that there are ways in which the accountability of boards, and this was particularly true in the Women of Color Resource Center, boards sometimes really assume the kinds of responsibilities for the health of an organization and the many different kinds of health an organization needs to have to sustain itself and grow and make an impact. And then sometimes they don't. So the relationship between the executive director and the board and the community that ultimately it's responsible to. There are many sites for problems and failures. In the particular case of the Women of Color Resource Center, in terms of its last board, there were failures in fiscal oversight, there were failures in hiring process, there were failures in accountability, mutual accountability among board members, and the accountability of the board to the community as a whole. And then in terms of staff, I think, especially in social justice organizations, folks come on staff and as staff, folks may have different expectations around issues like transparency and democracy that may or may not be shared by an executive director and a board. And it's also true that staff may come on and have unrealistic expectations about what a social justice job can deliver in their lives. And so, I think there are, complicated issues involved in making your livelihood in a social justice context that need to be questioned and discussed amongst those of us who are doing exactly that. Then I'll just say a couple of other things, because I know my time is running. The money stuff really matters. And whether or not you have somebody who's deeply trustworthy, who's keeping the books, whether folks, both executive director and board, have the skills and the patience to really pay attention to that side of the work, a lot can go wrong on the money side. I'm just going to leave it at that. I think the other things in relationship to the Women of Color Resource Center, just to kind of make note, and hopefully we'll be able to come back and have some conversation about this. There was one of the things that happened was a generational transition in leadership, and those generational transitions, as with what's sometimes called founder syndrome, those generational transitions can be complicated. The elders can hold on in ways that they ought not to, and when they need to let go, they can hold them. And new generations coming into the work in terms of how they understand the legacy of an organization and whether and how to carry it forward, and whether and when and how to change it. All of those are complicated questions. So I just say the issue of not just a change in leadership, but a generational transition and a founder moving on, all of those add complexity, I think, to organizations and take organizations to a place where their weaknesses will surface. So I think those are the main things I want to convey to folks. I've taken a fair amount of time, but I think one of the other things that's mentioned kind of deeper in this paper is the importance of people really stepping up and not hanging back when they see something that looks wrong, figuring out how to, articulate, step up, stay on it, and be willing to have the kinds of difficult conversations and or struggles to hold each other accountable in a way that can preserve the kinds of institutions that take a lot to build but are pretty easy to tear down. I'm going to leave it at that.
Okay, and you get a chance, Linda, to explore some of those other elements that you weren't able to go into deeply, but we're going to ask taliba to come and talk about what is meant to grow that organization and give a little bit about the history and what you all do. And because we didn't want it to be all doom and gloom, I mean, Linda and Bill, we're going to talk about 2 failed projects, but we also wanted to hear what works. What are you all doing, and what are some of the challenges that MXGM is facing?
Okay, great. So you want me to jump in?
Yes.
Okay, cool. And that's so interesting because I was like, wait, let me get my notebook out and start taking notes, because many of the things I wanted to talk about, you were naming. So I was like, oh, okay, cool, awesome. So yeah, so free to land, everyone. I am taliba Obuya. I'm a member of the New African Peoples Organization and the current national coordinator of the Malcolm X Grassroots Movement. And I'm just excited to be on this panel as a young person, but then also being like a movement fan of each of you all. I'm just excited to be here. So Baba Makungu put out the request and I'm here. So some of the things I wanted to speak on, and I know, one, I can talk really fast, so let me know if I need to slow down. And then 2, it's so interesting because a lot of the stuff you were saying, Mama Linda, I was literally going to point out. So I think as MXGM, and just for background for folks who may not know Malcolm X Grassroots Movement, we are the mass association of the New African Peoples Organization. And so that's kind of like our parent organization. And by being mass means that we are a grassroots self-determination, revolutionary nationalist organization. We are not a nonprofit. We don't have a 501c3 status. We don't have paid staff. And so that can kind of be like both ends. So it's so good to hear you name some of those different pieces. But the first thing I wanted to lift up is that we are truly intergenerational. I know often we name that as a movement value or something to do, but a lot of our Black radical organizations are either elders, many are elders, and for the most part, most of them are young, young members, young leadership, and all of that. And so, and I think that there's something inherently weak to be like one demographic. And so with us being intergenerational, our founders are, they were activists in their 19s, 20s, like 15 years old. And so that gets to my second point I wanted to lift up is that we do tend to be very historical in Malcolm X Grassroots Movement. Just meaning that, as I said, MXGM is the Association of the New African Peoples Organization, and our founders were also young activists and those young members moving, but we know that we come out of the New Africans Independence Movement. And so that is, which was leading on from the Black Power movement. And so we know that our shoulders that we're standing on is not something that we began to like fight for self-determination today, but we are of Queen Mother Moore, Malcolm X, and Robert Williams. So we learn those movements and how they come out, and the lessons in that period of history of resistance. And I think that's just really, really important, because we know in this, we know in this new wave of energy, it definitely was a lot of, either people were excited about the 2014 energy that rose up, and then they would like go literally back to the civil rights movement. or like SNCC and different things, and we ignore the whole Black Power movement or the new African independence movement. Like there was still movement beyond the party, which again gets lifted up, but there were many organizations around. So I'm excited to again be on panel. And so I would just say like that's a really, really big lesson. Being able to be intergenerational allows for us to be historical, and then we're able to kind of continue and know that we're a part of that continuum. I would say internally for MXGM, we move currently by 6 principles. And these are like our organizing principles. And that leads into like this willingness to correct. So again, when MXGM was founded, it came from members who might have been either out of the party or BLA or RAM or House of Umoja, the PG, Provisional Government for RNA, apologies on the abbreviations. But so it was all these different formations coming together to build up this new body of work, or this new container for work. And so again, like it was just these different views. And so when MXGM was founded, we had 5 principles, which was like a short sentence, like we are for the human rights of Black folks, we demand reparations, we demand freeing the land, we demand an end to genocide against our people. So not just enslavement, but the conditions that Black folks were in the 80s and the 90s, 70s and 80s, and that's when we were created. And then our 5th principle was like we demanded the release of political prisoners, prisoners of war, and our POWs, our exiles, and we wanted them returned. And so, like I said, those were 5 principles. But then as our elders and women in movement who come out of the Black Power movement and were in the New Africans Independence movement, they were like, no, we need to put an organizing principle around sexism. And so our 6th principle, which is not a founding principle, but it's to end sexist oppression and anything that might limit women and girls. And so I lift that up as a lesson because even the elders speak on that, like it's something to be able to reflect and respond. And so we adopted a 6th principle, which identified gender. And that was a big moment in our organization. I believe that they said that there was like some splits or folks may have left from that. And then I would say, but then at the same time, like I said, we do have that first principle that was around the human rights and self-determination for all new Africans, which we identify Black folks in the U.S. empire as. And so then again, a conversation came up around a 7th principle. Maybe we needed to add an additional principle around sexuality and expanding gender. And what does that mean? Because as I stated, MXGM is a revolutionary nationalist organization. And that means a couple different things, but we identify a Black nation inside of the U.S. And we ultimately want the self-determination of that. And what does that really look like? What does the relationship to Black people and this U.S. empire really look like for our everyday lives? And so again, this space to allow for principle struggle, ideological struggle, we didn't adopt the 7th principle, but we wanted to be really clear with our first principle. So instead of just having that sentence, it went to elaborate that means all new Africans, sexuality, gender, religion, and all of those pieces. And I would have to say like that was really a point of tension. And then once again, our organization, I wouldn't say a per se split, but I think we definitely maybe lost some folks, added some folks in, folks stayed to wage the ideological struggle to have around that. But the organization still embodies these pieces around gender. So our leadership is like I said, I'm the national coordinator, but we know that at any one time, 2 men cannot lead our organization. At the same time, it's okay for women to lead. Like I've definitely have had a female woman coordinate with me, but never 2 men leading our organization, because we don't just have these principles on paper, but we want to embody them. And then I think another lesson that has allowed for MXGM to be so long withstanding, because our founders are from that Black Power movement, So we're from a time where resistance and identifying and fighting on behalf of Black people was under attack. Like there was like live assault in the streets. My eldest bring up a piece around security. And so he lets us know that after Malcolm X was assassinated, security was no longer in that leader's role. And there is this thing around chain of command when we're dealing with security, and that's held by a different wing. And I just bring that up because, again, being in movement space now, being in how we're trying to figure out our response, I think a lot of this, like, no hierarchy of leadership, or we want to make things equal. We know that we have to think about chain of command. And so I was just thinking about that as this lesson learned. It feels that one of the things we need to combat with now is like, how don't we do a baby with the bathwater syndrome? That's what I'm calling it. If I could be like Bill, I would write more. But just thinking that we like throw stuff away, like we immediately like, this ain't grandmama's civil rights movement, so we threw away stuff, which means that we literally, like, one, I feel was disrespectful to Black women's leadership, but then two, I don't think we were really understanding the narrative to even just label a civil rights movement. I think we've always demanded human rights. But I do say that with this hierarchy of space, that if we are really challenging power, we have to understand what that looks like. And so chain of command is necessary if we're thinking about security. So so just knowing that, again, we move, we try to course correct or look at our things. I think some other lessons, I think it's another lesson I would say, knowing around challenging power. Again, with 2014, I think it definitely allowed a beautiful spontaneous uprising happened, and we were able to see like enough is enough. And I think just that beauty of when we think about resistance and we think about we drew a land in the sand or the asphalt of Ferguson, and I would say that that was seeded from us not being able to react like we have wanted to Katrina, but we were building, and OBS was there, which is a 30-year organization. So I don't think like a lot of stuff was just seeds of wildfire finally blossoming, but I think like it was this coordinated piece. And so I say this thing back around being clear around challenging power. I do feel as though sometimes we call revolutionary acts or radical, like new waves of response. And to me, I think it's more about maybe it's more like radical assimilation or radical reform that is happening. And we're not per se challenging power. And if we did demand to like challenge power, I think that would allow us to move in different ways. Because once we would try to prepare ourselves for the response from power when we show our power. And so I would say that that'll just go like to some of my last points around COINTELPRO being real. I think again, being ahistorical really leaves this gap for us to maybe understand the situations that we're dealing with now. Because then if we really looked at the 60s and the 70s repression that happened, if we look like back to even like the 20s and the 30s, and like how people get attacked, how people get out of movement, I think is really real. So really, I would say that's our final lesson that I would like to lift up. I also feel like I've been talking a little bit too long. Is this thing around volunteer discipline, which is just really, really interesting. That, like I said, at MXGM, we don't have paid staff. We've received certain grants, or maybe like a summer camp, or maybe our different chapters have received local grants around Cop Watch and different work like that, but we don't have a funding stream. So on the flip side, people aren't able to sustain themselves and build themselves. So that's a question we always ask our elders, like, y'all were in a party, how did that work? How did y'all pay rent? Like, rent ain't new for young people, so how do we do that? But I do think there's this thing, this culture of nonprofits that people automatically expect to be paid for their liberation. I think that's kind of like an oxymoron, but I think we ultimately want to get paid for fighting for our liberation, and getting paid that stream of income might misdirect our goals and our objectives. And I'll be honest and think that that's playing out a lot. And then I think that then leads us to confuse our jobs that we have with our political homes. And then I think we also kind of, like I was thinking earlier, we tend to tap out because we have these expectations of movement. We have these expectations of fighting for Black liberation. And when those needs or expectations are met, then we'll go self-care versus community care. And it just leaves our movements in this gradual space of it. So while we have been able to build MXGM, and I think there's definitely been beautiful heights of MXGMs with our Black August concerts, our capacity to be global and reach other continents, we do struggle with this point of volunteerism in a mass association organization. And what does that mean to have a discipline if that value is about getting paid, now that, you know, Black love and Black liberation is trendy? So I'll stop there. I have more to say, but I think I need to take a break.
Thank you. Thank you. I really appreciate those comments, and a number of those points definitely resonate with me, and I'm sure with Bill. In the case of the Women's Resource Center, that was a 20-year-old organization that within a matter of months after a new and young ED was put in the position, brought the organization down fairly quickly. In the case of the Black Radical Congress, we barely made it to 10 years. And that was a struggle the last few years. But I'm going to ask Bill to come in and, you know, talk a little bit about the piece that he and I co-authored about really lessons learned from trying to build the BRC. And then, you know, other comments that insights that he has around both, I would say, building the labor movement and community organizations, and sometimes those are built in a very different way. And so you've been a chance to be in both of those camps. So just really sharing some of those insights that you might have.
I'm off. Thanks, Jamal, and thanks to OBS and Taliba and Linda for your presentations, and for, excuse me, to you, the listeners and viewers. If you haven't yet read Linda's summation, you got to read it. It's really extraordinary, and in some ways, it reads like a novel. So I strongly recommend that. There's many things that both Linda and Taliba raised that overlap with things that I wanted to say, and I'll try to make this as pointed as possible. One is a point that Linda raised that I frame this way. It's easy to both form an organization and to close an organization. It's hard as hell to sustain an organization because you're fighting against the forces of entropy, the forces that tear things apart. And that means that you have to exert an immense amount of energy to keep an organization going. So when Jamala said that the BRC was a failure, I would qualify that. Most organizations have a certain lifespan. The question is, during their lifespan, what do they accomplish? And so we, in the BRC, as Jamala just said, we made it 10 years, basically. There were certain things that were accomplished. There was much more that needed to be accomplished, but it created a certain dent. It created a condition that I would argue the movement for Black Lives built upon. And so in that sense, it succeeded. The paper that Jamal and I wrote, I don't want to reiterate all of the points, but I want to just highlight a few that really strike me. One is to go back to something that Taliba said about chain of command. I'm gonna frame it in a different way. There's this whole notion of horizontalism that has spread through the movement. This whole idea that all organizations should be flat. That, as Taliba said, no clear leadership. Everybody can be a leader, etc. And as I said to an anarchist friend of mine the other day, those organizations don't exist. There is no flat horizontal organization. All organizations are like Russian dolls. They exist in concentric circles. And there's a core. Around that core is a certain kind of periphery. Around that periphery, there's another, and so on. Every organization is like that. And the thing about the core includes people that are formal leaders as well as people that are not. And the question for any organization is whether it works to expand the core or whether it turns the core into a clique. And an organization that turns the core into a clique is an organization that's going to die or become a cult. And so one of the things that we were good at in the beginning, the BRC, we built a core. And a core of people that were very dedicated to building the BRC, very broad-minded, very anti-sectarian, and we're looking to be very inclusive. The organization weakened when the core weakened. And there was a direct relationship. When some of the key people who had thrown a lot of time into building the organization pulled back, it put an immense amount of pressure on those that remained. And this is something for every organization to consider, that when you're building, you have to always assume that your core will last a certain amount of time, but it's not going to last indefinitely. And you can't plan around that. So there needs to be a constant effort to rejuvenate the core. A second thing is that the BRC was in part built by dedicated members of a number of different organizations that included the New African People's Organization, the Communist Party, Freedom Road, Committees of Correspondence, and a few others that put members in to help to build the organization. And as Taliba said, this wasn't like people were getting paid. This was volunteer work, and people put an immense amount of time into building the organizations. And if you look throughout history, you see that that's really critical, that a dedicated core of people or cadre of people, whether it's in the trade union movement, the African American movement, any number of others, have to put more time. There's this sort of magical way we've often looked at organization, as if people just sort of spontaneously come together, are spontaneously dedicated to all this stuff, and we ignore that there's usually not only a core, but there's cadres of people that are going way beyond the call of duty. We were very successful in being anti-sectarian, and fighting the tendency towards purism, and recognizing that there were different tendencies within the Black left that needed to be represented in this effort. Also, in the beginning, quite intergenerational, but I want to come back to that, as well as taking up serious fights around sexism and homophobia. One of the things I want to say about the generational piece is also related to some earlier points, that many of us that were baby boomers and some older have great difficulty embracing younger activists. And this is not unique to our generation. From what I can tell, it basically happens almost every generation, that there's these kind of struggles. And one of the ways it plays itself out is what I would call the one more grasp at the ring phenomenon. And that's where you get some people who have been leaders or want to be leaders that want at least one more time to be the great leader. And they are very reluctant to join hands with younger people because they see the younger folks as competitors as opposed to comrades. And so that was one of the challenges. The other challenge that we faced, that I think we addressed, Jamala, was on the other end, something that I started to see in the mid-90s, which was among younger activists, that I call it the walkaway phenomenon. And that was when there were struggles or differences, people would just like walk away. And like when I became radicalized, when I was like in my teens, we were always told there was something called a no struggle attitude. You didn't just walk away, you struggled things out. Excuse me. But what I started to notice in a number of different settings was people just like walking away. And that was it. It's like, well, wait a minute. I mean, that was just like a struggle. This is something we couldn't quite deal with. Another issue that I think is a very important lesson for all organizations is for the leadership to be constantly aware of the mandate of the organization. That is, what is it that unites the majority of the members? And recognizing that you can push the envelope on the mandate to a certain point and try to move the organization, but you can't jump too far ahead. And one of the big problems that we ran across, and for which I've been very self-critical, is that we had a major internal struggle around something that at first didn't appear to be something that would result in a struggle. And that was at a point when in Zimbabwe, the government of then President Mugabe was engaged in significant repression of opposition. There were people that I knew from Zimbabwe that were imprisoned and tortured. It wasn't just imaginary. And so the coordinating committee of the BRC signed on to a statement criticizing President Mugabe on this and calling for an end to the repression. The problem is that what we discounted was that there was a significant part of the organization that had a different attitude towards President Mugabe. And we were not sufficiently in touch with that sentiment. Didn't mean that we were wrong, didn't mean that they were right, or vice versa, but that it was really important that in advance to have had a clearer sense as to what the parameters were. And sometimes an organization is in a situation where you can't take a position. Even if you as a leader feel very strongly about something, it may in fact go beyond the mandate of the organization, the mandate the organization has given the leadership. And you've got to respect that. Otherwise, you shouldn't be a leader. That's why there's certain people out there that are wonderful as pundits, as commentators, because they're accountable only to themselves and God, right? They can say whatever they want, but so they're not in the context of an organization where they got to pay attention to what the mandate is. There's many other things that I want to say, but we don't have a lot of time, and I want to make sure we have plenty of time. I just want to add 2 points, one from the summation and something I thought about later. One from the summation was that in building an organization that has organizations and individuals, there is a tension that exists. And the tension is that the organizations that contribute to building a united front, let's say, believe, and I think correctly, that they have a special role to play in that united front. And individuals who join such a united front or mass grouping also have an important role to play. But balancing those things is really hard. Because the organizations that can help to build a united front, they have to continue to build themselves too. And there's that tension that works at the organization. And it was something that we lived with the entirety of the existence of the BRC. Now, the thing that wasn't in the summation, but something I think a lot about, that I would argue that we on the left are terrible at, is not dealing with mental and emotional illnesses and not recognizing that there are many people that are emotionally and mentally damaged that are attracted to our organizations because our organizations by definition are made up of alienated people, right? We are alienated from the system. I mean, we are. We don't embrace this. We're alienated from this. And there are people that are emotionally and mentally damaged, that are alienated, and they are attracted to our organizations in many cases. And because many of us on the left don't take emotional and mental illnesses seriously, within which I include substance abuse, we are often unprepared for what happens within the organization when these things start unfolding. When you're dealing with someone who is bipolar or schizophrenic, someone who's an alcoholic, or some other form of substance abuse. And one of the things about many substance abusers in particular is that they know how to manipulate people. And this can happen in an organization. And when the organization is not prepared to deal with it, it can rip the organization apart. And people can start leaving, get turned away, throw up their hands and say, "To hell with this." And we have to become, as a left, much better at dealing with this, and not fearing that in dealing with mental health and emotional issues in an organization, that's going to be the death of the organization, that that's somehow anti-working class or something else. That, not to be overly Machiavellian about this, but it's also the case that the forces of law and disorder know how to utilize people who have mental and emotional illnesses and damage. And time has shown over and again how that can happen. So there's other things that I was going to raise, but we can do it in a discussion.
So I think, the points that have been raised have been very spot on. And Bill, thank you for clarifying the failure part. I didn't quite mean it a total failure, because I still am inspired by what came out of the BRC. I think I really meant the fact that we weren't able to continue at a time when the Black left needed that kind of a formation. And we really haven't had one since then that comes to that kind of intensity. So I'm going to open it up. I don't know if Azizi has questions, but I was going to start us off with some. So, this whole point, and this is for Taliba, because one of the things that you mentioned, and I hear it a lot from young organizers, particularly millenniums, and that is that people do want to get paid. And I've been struggling with that, because folks in my generation that gave their heart and soul, like later on when they got to be sick, there was no health insurance, there was nothing. And so I tried to understand where people are coming from, but I think I've come to the place where you got to pay some dues first, and then you do have to take care of yourself. But it seems like the folks who there's money for jobs are not the ones who are most committed to the struggle. And so I don't know how that happens either. So so can you speak to that, like what it means to get paid, and what happens when that's the driving force around somebody that's in a revolutionary organization?
Right. So I don't know if I can overtly speak to it in a way that gets us to any type of agreement, because I think I differ from many of my like age. I'm just out of the millennial boat, but yeah, I don't know. Like I also don't think that movement is, or not even movement, because our words end up meaning other things. But I don't think the revolutionary or your organizations, your radical organizations, is where you come to quote unquote sustain yourself. I do think that you should be sustaining that organization and building that up. And what does that mean? Like, I don't know, because I hear, I don't know, because I hear these same conversations. Folks will go, I need a job, but I need to do this and do that. So I'm like, well, great, go work for Comcast, or go get an admin job, or go do something. I don't know. Hate like go to school, live off of student loans. But not in the sense that I don't think we get paid to get free. This might be old teaching, but I also know that nonprofits came in the 80s and they'd be like, oh, what happened to resistance, or what happened to movement? And that was one of the things, like, people quote unquote got jobs. I do see, I work for a nonprofit. So I'm not trying to like go and do something different. But as I said, MXGM does not pay. Like, we're a dues paying organization. We try to do our fundraisers. Might want to make a pitch now, but no, I just wonder, what is this balance? Because I do think, like, when you go decide to get nonprofit money or the grants or the different things, because in another hat of mine, I'm a funder as well. And we know that funding has been something that was like a part of our movements too, like the Jane Fondas and the different folks, like, not saying that there can't be access to resources when it comes to movement and building up our organizations and building up, hopefully, like, our movement front and building a viable movement. But I don't think that we should stop challenging people on, if they can't get paid, then they're not willing to do the work. Because I do hear it, like, I think about Mama Harriet, like, where did she retire off to, and her 401k? And then a few weekends ago, I had the great privilege to sit at the feet of Baba Akbar Ahmed and Muhammad, and like, just trying to see like what he has been able to do and continue to do in movement. But it was also this feelings amongst our young folks was like, oh, should we set up an elder fund? Should we do this? Because I did have an elder, Mami Aminato, who was like, look, you come into this work to fight for liberation and freedom. You may not see that mountaintop, but don't give this movement 50 years and then you feel regretful that you don't have a pension plan. Because she's like, movement don't have no pension plan, movement don't have no thank you, movement don't have I'm sorry, movement. And so I think that we should continue to just challenge that. And I think I also received that, yes, we should sustain and try to figure out how to engage people's sustainability, like livelihoods, but I don't think that that should be the marker. And I feel as though we should challenge that in all points. So like, as while young people can bring this to us and people are getting this money to have these convenience and fly people out, and we are getting these directors and all these different titles, I don't know. I just think that we should challenge that a little bit.
Yeah, I hear you. And I'm still, my view is still evolving around that. Either Linda, you or Bill want to speak to that?
Just
The point
briefly.
of it is truly the not-for-profit impact on our movement, and the fact that there's dollars there. And one of the things I tell people is OBS was Black-led 1980 when we first were founded, but now all of a sudden there's money for Black-led organizations. So this is all very interesting. So, you know, what do you think about that, Linda?
I think it's a really complicated issue. You know, I mean, I definitely came up with you know, it's all volunteer. You do it on your own time. You figure it out. You know, there'll be childcare and lunch at the meeting, but other than that, that's all you're getting. And the satisfaction of doing the work, which is a real thing. You know, the deep satisfaction of doing the work. But you know, I think the intersection of the even social justice work, even if it's not like framed as a revolutionary, and revolutionary work, and the nonprofit sector just was not as developed at that point. Now I think we have a different set of circumstances. There's also something about, I have to say, and this deserves more analysis than what I can give to it, but I came up in a period where the economy was a little bit more forgiving than it is now. so I think there's also something to the fact that for a lot of young people coming towards this work, like I did essentially half-time secretarial work for possibly decades. I don't remember how long, but a very long time. Part-time so that I could give the rest of my time to the work that I felt like had meaning. You can't live on that. You can't live like that anymore. The ways in which the economy has changed, people have 2, 3, 4 jobs. You can't do like part-time work and have food on your table, which at a certain point I was able to do that with shared housing and everything else. So I'm just saying there's some back factors, in terms of do people have their time if they're working 4 jobs and raising a family to do this kind of work without pay. And then I think also the nonprofit sector and the folks doing really, I think, fabulous work in that sector, that's a real thing. That's not going anywhere. It may change over time, but I think there are, and having that work institutionalized and fairly stable, I think is important for our movement. It's also true at the same time that initiatives will come not out of that sector. All kinds of revolutionary and radical momentum will come that's not in that sector. And I think we have to get used to a movement that is organizationally and structurally complex and figure out how the different parts of it interrelate and make all of us stronger.
Okay, I have, there's a question that came in and I'm going to throw to Bill since he raised the issue. And then I have another question that's come in that I'm going to pitch to all of the panelists. And that is the issue around mental health issues. And one of the things that you said, Bill, was almost seemed that those mental health issues were external. But I've been in organizations long enough to know that some of those mental health issues was caused by the movement or caused by the behaviors in organizations. So it's both. But the question is, how do we engage movement leaders with mental health issues and diagnose mental health issues? And so what do we need to do in our movement and in our organizations?
Before I get to that, Jamala, I just want to jump in one quick thing on this
Sure.
nonprofit issue. So I think it's important for people to keep in mind that beginning in the late 70s, 80s, early 80s, there was a sort of NGOification around the world that was in part the result of progressive movements fighting to institutionalize, but also the other side attempting to neutralize movements. And all of that was going on at the same time. So it wasn't just simply that the other side was trying to neutralize us. We were also building institutions. And in building institutions, you ultimately have to have resources. And that's where things got really complicated. The second thing is, I would argue that we are still suffering the results of Reagan and Reaganism. And that Reagan and Reaganism promoted entrepreneurialism. It was anti-collective, it was highly individualistic, and it permeated our culture, even among progressives, so that people were valuing, they came to see their value always monetized. And so I think that that's important. And I think that what you were saying, Linda, about the economy is definitely true, although it's also the case that people have been poor before and had to do stuff voluntarily. But there is something about, so I think it's a combination of factors that have influenced this, and it's very dangerous. In terms of the specific question, Jamala, I'm not a mental health therapist or specialist, but I'll tell you what I've recommended to organizations. I think every organization needs to have within its ranks people that get mental and emotional health on staff, as board members or whatever. to help to advise the organization. And I did not mean to suggest that these problems are externally driven. I meant more that they are manipulated sometimes by outsiders. But I remember when I worked for SEIU, Service Employees International Union, at one point, and I said to the guy who eventually became the president, Andy Stern, I said that I thought that in every organizer training, there needed to be a therapist. And he seemed to think that that was funny. And I said, no, I think that folks have to understand the various challenges that working class people are grappling with and how those things are manifested. Because when you go out there organizing, it's not like one-dimensional. You're not dealing with one dimension in a person. You're dealing with the totality of that, and the emotional and mental ramifications of capitalism, as well as chemical and biological things that people are dealing with. So I would say that we need to include within our ranks people that know this stuff, and there may be various forms of like support groups that can be set up in different organizations. The problem when we don't do things like that is that what I've seen is at first, when these issues are highlighted, there are folks that become very defensive, sometimes very opportunistic, and saying, no, you can't, there's nothing wrong with this person. This is just this is class bias or something like that. And then at some point, people just leave. They vacate the premises because they don't want to deal with the situation anymore, and they don't feel equipped to deal with it. So that's a direction I would recommend.
So I think there's some of our participants who agree with that, and actually saying there just needs to be more space in our organizations for reflection, for dealing with these issues, and not because I've seen it consume organizations too. But I think the point that's being made is if we don't recognize it, and if it's too extreme, if we can't deal with it at an organization, then we need to find someone who can. So I agree. It's a very important issue. So, one question that's come to us is how can Black organizations engage in the 2020 presidential elections, and how can we engage in those elections that actually build our base towards a more democratic revolution? So any one of you all can take that one. That's a real strategic question there.
Well, I'll just make a couple of comments on that one. This conversation is taking place in the context of, a dramatic crisis in the country as a whole. And in a period where, this is a complete, this is a cliche, but they're both opportunities and enormous challenges. I think that the opportunity is that the fact that 2016 followed on 2014, and that kind of momentum, that following on Ferguson, and the energy and creativity of people coming new to struggle really changed the conversation in the country in a way that we could not have expected, and in a way that was extraordinarily positive, and I'm somebody who believes that our movements kind of go in ebbs and flows over time, and that momentum of 2014 and forward pulled us out of, kind of a little bit of a doldrums, I'm just going to say, in a way that was extraordinarily positive. And then on the heels of that comes 2016, and the, I don't know if you could say it's positive, but if there's any positive side of 2016, it's that, wake up, hello, this is the country you're living in. including the racism and the xenophobia. And I think that's not new to anybody on this call, but it was new to a whole bunch of people who are not paying attention. So so I think, kind of that combination, trying to figure out how you bring that combination of factors forward to 2020, both the energy that was created around issues of police violence, not only issues of police violence, but trying to figure out how that energy is brought forward into a new set of circumstances, how the nakedness of voter suppression which has been going on for a very long time, but how the nakedness of voter suppression has been brought up into the national public dialogue. Those feel like opportunities to mobilize Black folk in particular in relationship to this election. And I think we also have ongoing conversations to have about the relationship of membership-based and grassroots organizing, which is ongoing regardless of the election cycle, and what are the best ways to intersect that work with electoral politics, which are like a different deal and has its own pace and structure, and et cetera, et cetera. Those are issues that I think we have to open up and discuss in an ongoing way.
So I know one of the perennial tensions and contradictions that we have in the Black liberation movement has always been to participate or not participate in electoral politics. So I'm gonna ask the other two panelists to specifically talk about what that base building could look like, and strategically, what are we trying to accomplish through our participation in the 2020 presidential elections?
Yeah. So, I think two things. I think that the last question you asked, I would love it as a young person for the Black left to kind of think about that and put that out there. I've been looking towards the 2020 elections since 2012, I have to say, because I was just thinking anyway, it's not about me. I was going to say, if 2008 didn't go the way I thought it would go, or I wanted it to go. And so I knew since he won 08, he was going to win 12. So then I really was thinking where are we at with 2012? And I think a critique of opportunity for the Black left, I think, has been what alternatives are we allowing for folks? Because again, I think that contradiction of do we participate in electoral the electoral politics, again, the elders was like, this wasn't the first time that Black folks have participated in this. We have the whole the Black Panther Party started with the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party thing. And it wasn't this thing about the need to vote, but to exercise power. And so I think from a base building stance, what would that look like if Black left folks with our politics and the gamut of what makes up the Black left was having these community conversation town halls, was having some teach-ins and teach-outs, was standing in the Popeyes line for that chicken sandwich and registering folks to vote, but then inviting them out to an assembly. Because the Malcolm X grassroots movement, we ran Baba Chokwe in a city council race twice, and then a mayoral race. And now Chokwe Antar Lumumba is now the current mayor of Mississippi. And we saw that it makes sense that if you are a certain percentage of the population, you thus should be in control and be governed. So I would think that this would be the time that the Black left is hopefully trying to interrupt even this reparations conversation that's being had. I feel like that whole concept, demand for reparations, is being redefined. I feel like a very, very deep ahistorical process is happening with that. And I feel like it's the duty of the Black left to interrupt that. So that's what I would like to go back and see. And I wonder if we could kind of take some of those lessons or some of that vision with even the BRC into something like 2020. Because I would say the reason when I started to look at elections differently, again, the properties of having elders, was that fascism had been thrown around so loosely and not really connected to its definition or the reality of what that looked like. But I just remember the Trump elections, and I just thought he was going to win. A glass half empty. I moved from human behavior. I don't know. But when I was saying that, my elders was really like looking at it, and I could tell they had an analytical mind to it. It wasn't simply just I'm with her or the whatever it would roll, feel the burn. But it was like, no, we talked about forecasted fascism in the 70s, in the 80s, in the 90s, and now we see that alignment. And so what does that mean? And so again, I think that we could do some fundamental base building, interjecting the Black left analysis of this moment. I think we need to do some interruption and hopefully some intervention between this reparations piece. Maybe because I'm on the Black left, I'd be like, team us, we should be taking that space up. But yeah, I'll stop there. But I do think that, as Queen Mother Moore would say, we should be where the masses of our people are. And seeing that folks have been living 4 years under Trump, they will want an alternative. And I think it's on the duty of the Black left to hopefully be able to direct our folks, or at least create space for conversations so we can envision what it is that we do want. And then again, I think we have to put in context national conversation or the national elections, yes, but what are we doing at the local levels? How are we holding the Senate and the House down? Who is our public commissioners? Things like that. That's how I would hold it.
Bill, you want to jump in?
Yeah, so Trump is the spokesperson of white minority rule. And I say that because that is the future that the right-wing populists envision. That there'll be a white minority, and they're looking at this sort of as almost like a neo-apartheid kind of situation, in which they're trying to enlist masses of whites who are fearful, uneasy about the changing demographics, but also that for many whites, it doesn't pay to be white anymore. At least that's how they perceive it. And so Trump has played into that. Now, I think that many people made a mistake in 2016 in thinking that it didn't matter whether Trump got in. Because I think that a part of the mistake was thinking that Trump was a buffoon, that he would get in and he'd be sort of Bozo the Clown, and that nothing would really change. And they were underestimating the nature of the right-wing populist movement that has been growing for years and what the ramifications are. Fascism is a subset of that. The larger movement is this right-wing populist movement. So there's a great deal that's at stake in this election in terms of everything from Supreme Court appointments to down ballot issues. Taliba mentioned other down ballot, and I want to say that people need to keep in mind that one of the objectives of a part of the Republican Party is a federal constitutional convention to change the US Constitution, and that they are maybe about 6 states away from being able to call something like that. So these down ballot elections become very, very important. So given that, two things. One is the need for us in the Black left to participate in building independent political organizations that can operate inside and outside of the Democratic Party and can really tap into our base and articulate a different set of politics. But the other thing, which may be a bit controversial, is that we in the Black left have an obligation not only to African Americans, but we have an obligation to lead the progressive movement in the United States. And there are many of my friends and colleagues in the Black left that don't look at it like that. They basically feel like our job is to focus on us, and white folks need to take care of themselves and do their own organizing, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that one of the things we got to recognize is that history and life doesn't move in a linear fashion, and that part of the job is for us on the left is to figure out how to bring certain movements and forces together so that we actually can create a block where we can win, not simply being on the defensive, but where we can actually win. And it's that notion of what they call emancipatory politics that we've got to be advancing. I would argue that that's central to the way we look at these coming elections.
So we have a few more minutes left, and so the last question that I'm going to pose to you all is, given that much of what organizing is about a way to pull people together to achieve a goal. So when we build in our organizations, it's about self-determination, it's about governance. What does governance look like? What does democracy look like? And in some of our organizations is very, in some cases, even anti-Black, and it's Black people doing it. So we got some real issues. And so I think when taliba raised the whole question of running people for office, that is supposed to be an extension of our organizations. And so if we can't get it together at the micro level, then how do we expect to run a city or run a county? And in the cases of organizations like NAPO, if we had 5 states, 7 states, 10 states, what would that look like? So my question to you is, what are the 1 or 2 things that Black organizations need to focus on in this next period in order to sustain themselves and even grow? One or 2 things that Black organizations need to be focused in on now that's going to help them break out of some of these negative organizing strangleholds, or what I call unblocking the chakras of our movement. What are those 1 or 2 things that we can leave people with, some takeaways?
I'm gonna jump in. One is that I think, related to something you were just saying, is that we have to have a clearer theory of power. That is, of what happens when we win. And by winning, I don't mean like the ultimate win, when we get rid of all the capitalists and we're on the road to heaven. But what I mean is, in between now and then, what happens when we take over cities? I don't think that we have a clear enough theory. I mean, we have a lot of programmatic points, but it's like, what do we do about administration? You know, enforcing laws. What do we do about the cops? What new forms of political accountability institutionally need to be put into place? What do we do about the strangulation of municipalities by the Republicans who use state preemption to basically restrict the ability of progressive municipalities and counties to do things? What's our alternative? What's the strategy? You know, it's like in any of these states, when we win, the reality is that the Republicans can use state preemption, surround us and strangle us, and then we look like we screwed up to the masses. The masses say, well, why the hell did we vote for you? You couldn't do a damn thing, right? Because we don't have a strategy to figure out, what do we do about state preemption? So I think that we've got to be thinking about all of that right now. And on top of that is building the kind of independent political organizations I was talking about before, within which there needs to be some serious political education that's dealing with helping people, helping to create the framework so that we defeat despair. Because I think that despair and cynicism are probably one of the greatest dangers that we're up against. And sometimes people mistake cynicism for revolutionary rhetoric and behavior, when cynicism is actually counter-revolutionary.
Well put. Taliba, you want to jump in on talking about what you think organizations need to be thinking about or doing? But in most cases, it seems like there's not a lot of thought into what we are doing. So maybe we need to step back and put more thought into it. So what are the 1 or 2 things that you think we should be focused on?
Yeah, so I think it's both and, or at least I try to push propaganda. I really do think we need some propaganda on the Black left, the revolutionary radical side, and just meaning in the space of where's the countertops, where's that next afro or the beret or the leather coats? Meaning, can we identify like our points of attack and also like our points of resistance? But then also, how can we do this from a mass level? I oftentimes wonder, like, are we really like in the masses? Do we really, like, I just think about some of the conversations I'm in because of my live life form and then how I work and being in MXGM. And then I take some of this stuff back to like family, like when I'm in Houston and Fifth Ward, like is Black folks having these conversations. And I'm never surprised at the analysis that they tend to carry, but are they having these entry points into movement? So I would say that. And then one of the things I think I've been overly fascinated since I've been introduced to like movement and learning, but I often wonder, like, how can we get back to debate societies or different things like that? I think, again, we don't always know all of the things that we should know, but like we know like there was like Frederick Douglass or not Frederick, but Booker T. Washington and WB or Malcolm and Martin. And I think we conflate that separate out. But I say that in the stance of how do we even move towards either a consensus of what we're trying to reach. And I think that that's really important because I do think we're living on so much different roads of resistance and movement. But I also oftentimes wonder, like literally carrying on from what Bill just said, but do we know where we're going? Like, do we know, like, not alone like what it's going to look like when we win? I don't even know if we can identify that we are losing or have won or what winning looks like, because either there's really 3 to 4 folks or there's pockets of conversations that we take as gold and we run with it. If you can go viral or get some tweets on Twitter or something like that. So I would say the 1 to 2 things is looking at that, like political education, I think is real, but how are we, the message around the propaganda. I'm always a fan. I'm like, we need propaganda, and then we need some type of format to engage, like the Black left engage. And then I know we want to then talk about the left and other progressive folks, and I agree we should be leading them and engaging with them. But I also think like we need to like know us. Like I think we know COINTELPRO was affecting us, but without the Weather Underground, we wouldn't have known that like we couldn't substantiate what was happening. So I do agree, like this cross net outside of the quote unquote Black, however we identify, but I think we also need some space to convene, to dialogue, to debate, to consent. Like, how do we reach alignment even? So if we can't get a consensus, how do we at least align?
Okay. So Linda, in terms of the last word on this one, you being a part of numerous organizations, both positive and otherwise, what do you think organizations need to be looking at right now in order to strengthen those organizations to take on the challenges that are facing us in 2020?
Well, facing us in 2020 and beyond. So first of all, I think one of the things that we need are spaces like this. So I want to, again, express my appreciation for you bringing us together so that we could have this conversation. These are the kinds of conversations we need collectively so that we can bring some of this back to the organizations that we're in and that we're building and use it as kind of fertilizer to help us grow our movements. So I guess in terms of, is a hard question because there's some of the stuff that we were talking about before about kind of the problems of nonprofit organizations or the challenges of nonprofit organizations. So there's a whole piece there about, figure out who you can learn from, figure out what is a set of people that need to be in conversation who may not be in the organization, but may have lessons to share or a vantage point that from outside the organization that could be helpful, those kinds of things. But I also, I guess I would also underscore a couple of other things. One is having organizations that are nimble enough and open enough to be able to capture some of the momentum that comes out of spontaneous movements, some of the momentum in the form of actual people who, because people, you could be in a situation where hundreds or thousands of people step forward. Not all those people are going to turn into organizers or activists. Naturally, their sense of outrage has been sparked and they want to be in the streets, and they're going to be in the streets, but they might be in the streets for a limited period of time. Then you got folks who come forward who, if cared for and worked with, will devote their lives to struggle. We need more people who are devoting their lives to struggle. So figuring out how to kind of capture some of that momentum, bring it into organization, nurture that new leadership, I feel like that's a really important piece. And then I guess I would just say, since our time is running, I just want to underscore the things that Bill and Taliba said. So on the issue of Black folks leading not only Black organization and Black struggle, but the struggle for democracy as a whole, I just, we don't have time to talk about it, but if we don't, we're in big trouble in this country. If we don't take on that role, and I know not everybody feels like that's their job, but I'm just going to say, in terms of the dynamic of this country and the underpinnings of this country, if we don't take on that role and that leadership, we're in real trouble. And then I guess the very last thing I'd say is, all of this also depends on, and this is to go back to something that Taliba was mentioning, all of it is also related to a deep and ongoing analysis of where are we? What time is it actually? What is on the agenda to be won? Are we in a defensive period or an offensive period? What's on the agenda to be won in the next 2 years, 5 years? And what are we looking for in 10 years, 15 years? Have we done the scenario work or not? So that piece about what actually is the balance of power in my city, in my municipal government, in my state government, and at the national and federal level. And if we're not working out of a deep analysis of that obviously is changed as circumstances change, then we're not working out of a strategic vision.
Absolutely. So I wanted to take the opportunity to again thank you all for joining us on the webinar. Our panelists have been fantastic. I've been taking copious notes from everybody, and I know that you all brought a lot to the table to offer, both in terms of your direct experiences and your theoretical insights. I want to give a shout out to Azizi Blissett, who's been helping with some of the technical stuff in the chat. Helping us from Atlanta, and then for all of you all who joined us on the webinar. And I will say that we hope that this conversation will continue. This is not, we hope it's the beginning. And as Taliba pointed out, we need more political education, and this actually could be one of those pieces where we folks look at the webinar and pick out some salient points and really dive deep into them. We've already had a number of Black academics who said they're going to use it in their classrooms. But I'm hoping that, on the community level, we can talk about some of these issues as we start to build and intensify our struggle going into 2020. So again, thank you all for participating and for sharing your insights. And as our brother always says, and I say it's reasons why he has to say it 3 times, that people go out and organize, and that was brother Toure. So again, thank you and have a safe and productive evening.